Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 7. So today I am super excited to be joined by Stuart Leeks, Principal Software Development Engineer at Microsoft, speaker and now book author. So his book, WSL2 Tips, Tricks and Techniques, is something we're certainly going to be talking about today. So a huge, massive welcome to the show, Stuart.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to catch up with you. It's been a while.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've been meaning to have this podcast recording for quite some time as well.
Yeah. I think things get busy and then it just keeps slipping, but it's good to be doing it.
Cool. Before we start, could you give us a quick background and introduction to yourself and what it is you do?
So currently I work at Microsoft as part of the commercial software engineering group. So we have dev teams and we will work with customer dev teams typically for around 3 months and basically kind of do some joint development work to help kind of kickstart or unblock challenges they're seeing as they try to adopt Microsoft services.
Sounds very cool. I think we were chatting one point a few months ago and you were saying you're doing some Go development. Sounds like you're jumping between lots of different technologies, so it sounds quite exciting.
Yeah, that project was kind of a fun one. It was all in the Kubernetes space. We were doing some work with Kubernetes operators for integrating Databricks into Kubernetes and Kubeflow for a customer who wanted to be able to span those two kind of worlds in that environment, and threw some load testing in along that for good measure.
That's one of the things I like about contracting as well, just the variation you get from the different contracts, like different teams. So we actually met like 4 years ago now, I think it was.
Wow, is it that long?
When you did the very first .NET Oxford talk. That's a long time ago now, isn't it? So I do owe you a huge thanks, because I'm not sure whether you remember my intro talk before your talk.
Yeah, well, I remember coming around I popped around to your house just before we headed up for that session, and you were trying to get me started on using Vim, which I still want to do and haven't managed to crack. And we had a good chat there, and I remember you had a few nerves, I think, didn't you, before doing the intro session.
I'd forgotten about the Vim thing. You've reminded me I can start nagging again now. I'd forgotten about that. So I was certainly nervous. I wasn't really expecting to be as nervous as I was, but then people started arriving. So then I got off and you got on. And the energy and passion you put into your talk, that kind of that's where I really got the hook. I wanted to get back up again and have another go and try and get better.
Oh, wow.
So that was kind of like where my enjoyment started, the public speaking. As I say, I owe you a huge, massive thanks for that. And then you've done a few lightning talks at .NET Oxford since. And I've got to say, I always feel really sorry for the person going on after you. Like the bar gets set so high.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. And I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of the nerves. And I still get nervous before a talk. For me, the point where I stop getting nervous is the point where I should stop giving talks, because there's something about taking some of that energy and channeling it and using the actual delivery as an outlet for that energy. But yeah, I mean, if you told younger me that I was going to get up and do talks and actually enjoy it, I wouldn't have believed it. I was the kid in class who hated having to kind of give an answer in front of the class. So it's been a bit of a journey from there to getting up and doing talks and getting a kick out of it. I think one of the turning points was, so my wife and I used to do a lot of salsa dancing. And there was one day we turned up to one of the classes and the person who ran it just said, so do you fancy teaching a class next week? And I was just like, you probably want to talk to my other half. Emily has done a load of teaching. She's amazing. So she basically taught a class for a while after that. And I was kind of her stooge in the middle for doing demonstrations with. And even that, I thought, the first week I thought I was going to throw up beforehand, even though I had nothing to do other than stand there and do what I knew I could do. But gradually I kind of got more confident with that. And then one week I said, maybe I'll have a go at teaching it, and kind of gradually did that and felt absolutely nervous as heck when I was doing that, and built up some confidence and started actually enjoying that. And then we actually ran our own salsa club for quite a few years. And the only night we could get a hall to run it on was a Friday night. And there was something about that just meant that you kind of were very conscious that people were making a choice to come out and see you on a Friday night, kind of the end of the working week. And it just kind of really focused us on the thing they're coming for is to have a good time. Like they want to just come and enjoy themselves. Yes, they want to learn some salsa, but they want to enjoy themselves because it's Friday night. And I think that just kind of started to build the energy. And I learned a ton from from Emily on that. And then I think since kind of that, I've taken that kind of mindset and that sort of energy into the tech talks I do. So I think a lot of it came from all of that kind of background. And if we hadn't done the salsa teaching, I never would have been up speaking. So I owe really a huge amount for that.
So does this mean that at the next in-person .NET Oxford where you do a talk, we're going to have dancing on the stage as well?
If you can get people up doing it, I'll teach it.
Challenge accepted. Oh dear. I think you're right about what you said about speakers nowadays. I think quite a few were maybe less confident when they were younger. I was exactly the same. And it was only like when I started going to college and then work afterwards that I started to get a bit more confident. But again, even then, even like 5 years ago, if you told me that I would be doing public speaking or especially like hosting a podcast, I would have been like, nah.
I am definitely an introvert. I like time to think about things, and the whole dynamics of fast-paced conversation, is challenging. And I remember there was a session that Michelle Dickinson, Dr. Michelle Dickinson, so she's on Twitter as Nano Girl. She's an awesome kind of STEM advocate. She had a session, which actually I think she did at one of the Microsoft events years back. And she just said, actually, public speaking is ideal for introverts. And I was just like, what? But it actually really helped me unpick, because I had this block in my head around being an introvert but liking getting up on stage and talking. And I couldn't reconcile the two. And part of the challenge, part of what is harder work as an introvert, is unpicking those cues that happen in a conversation, and then they're things that happen very quickly. But from the reading kind of around introverts and extroverts and the different patterns, there are different pathways that introverts use for processing those cues, and it takes longer, so it's harder work to try and keep up. Now, if you get up on stage and you've basically got the mic, all that goes away. You're in control. And there was kind of a few other bits. I'll try and dig out the link to the talks. It was a really interesting session. It really just, a lot of stuff just clicked into place for me then. And it started to make sense, and just kind of you start to see how the public speaking does actually work for introverts and people who maybe wouldn't naturally see themselves there.
I think actually what you just said then rings a bell from one of our past conversations probably a few years ago. And I might have actually repeated that to someone else and forgotten who told me. So now I know.
Yeah, she also did a session with James Whitaker around tips for public speaking. And they're kind of polar opposites in how they prepare. And it was a really interesting session, just seeing the two different kind of ways of going about it and how they kind of psych themselves up and things like that. And yeah, I totally recommend either of those talks.
Yeah, I can definitely connect with that, because if I'm doing anything where I've got to improvise, or if it's not around programming and technology, if I'm having to do small talk, I really struggle with that. But on stage, you're doing a talk that you've rehearsed.
Yeah.
You know it back to front, you've practiced it, and you're talking about something you love. And the people that are listening, they've come to listen. So you've kind of you've got over that hurdle.
Yeah, and I think talking about something that you're passionate about definitely helps. And that comes across. And faking that is difficult. And the preparation actually is a massive, massive thing. One of the things I remember from one of the James Whitaker sessions was know your first line. And it was basically, drill that. And there's a weird thing, because the more you practice, it's not just a linear kind of, the talk gets better the more you practice. And a little bit of practice kind of helps when you start to learn it. And if you start to practice a bit more, at least I find it can end up getting really wooden. Then you almost have to practice through it until you know that stuff inside out, and you lose the woodenness and you get back to being natural, but really knowing it. But kind of getting past that hump is quite effortful. And one of the bits that James Whitaker really helped me see was actually knowing your opening and your closing really well, and kind of getting past the wooden bit with those, and then maybe not rehearsing the middle bit quite as much. Because as long as you've got a good flow through the talk, you'll follow that journey that you've set yourself up for. But knowing the start and the end absolutely rock solidly just means that if you've got those nerves, when you go out there, you're on autopilot. You get over that initial period of nerves, and then you're into the natural flow. And then, having the solid closing just means that if anything does go a little bit bumpy, you get back onto that kind of safe territory for the ending, and you can still end strong. And that really kind of stuck with me when I've been prepping kind of full length sessions.
The thing that helps me is just having almost cue cards as you go through. So not just the start and finish, but not choreographing the whole thing, not every word, but just having almost like a bullet pointed list
Yeah.
where I can just glance at it and I know the next bit. And because I've rehearsed it, that's given me enough to just do the next section, and then I can glance back when I get to the next section. And I find that that's what helps me.
Yeah, I tend to try and use my slides as the cue cards. So if I find that as I'm walking myself through the talk and just practicing it, that there's a bit where I just go, I keep forgetting this thing. I'll figure out how I can structure the slides so that as I'm seeing those kind of on the monitor in front of me, I go, yes, I need to talk about that and move through. So I tend to change the actual slide content to be my cue cards in that sense. And then that kind of ratchets up a notch if you start getting into the lightning talk kind of piece. Lightning talks, I think, are an interesting variation on sessions.
So one thing that I always like in your lightning talks, that you have slides that just auto advance. So if you don't keep up with it, it's tough. It's going to advance to the next slide anyway. I don't think I could have the guts to do that.
Well, so I think lightning talks are really quite hard. I like to aim for a lightning talk to be 5 minutes, and I sometimes stretch them to 10. And that really just means you've got to kind of stick to the timing quite rigidly in a way that you don't have to for a 45-minute or an hour session. If you get a demo that doesn't work first time and you have to reset something and you've got 45 minutes, that's great. You can speed up somewhere else. You can cut a little bit down somewhere else and you can adjust them. You've got that buffer. In a 5-minute session, there just isn't the space for that. So I kind of go really regimented. And when I first tried a lightning talk, trying to finish on time felt really hard. So the auto-advancing slides just break the problem down, because you kind of set your content up, you go through it and record the timings, and then you do it again, and you go, well, actually, that was too long or too short. So you just tweak the content and what you're going to say and adjust bits like that. And then as you practice, kind of you realise that, oh, God, there's this one slide where I'm actually spending a minute and a half talking, and it's really hard to make sure I finish on the right time. Because if you suddenly finish early and you stood there waiting, that doesn't kind of work well. But equally, if you start running over, or actually the thing that happened to me most when I was practicing was I finished early and then went, I could just mention this. And then suddenly I'm halfway through that point and the slides have raced away beneath me. So at that point, again, I structure the slides differently, and maybe I have a build up in there. Maybe I split that slide into two, just so that each slide transition is relatively short. Because then, so long as you keep up more or less with those slides, like if you get slightly behind and the transition's slightly ahead of you, you can chop a little bit out and kind of get back on. But you know that as long as you're kind of keeping up there, you're going to finish on time. You just haven't got a choice in the matter at that point. But yeah, it did change. Like for auto-advancing slides, I definitely structure my slide deck differently.
I guess that helps with your energy level as well for the adrenaline.
Yeah, you just got to come out strong from the starting blocks and keep it going. There have been a couple of sessions where I've done the auto-advancing slides where there has been a slide that doesn't necessarily split down very naturally without kind of, you end up with a really awkward flow if you try and split it. But there's normally just a little animation, subtle or otherwise, that comes up on the slide at a certain interval just to give me a time check. So I know at that point, if you're still talking, you'd best finish up and get into the closing point for that slide to move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think out of all the lightning talk speakers, I've always got to keep track to make sure people aren't overrunning. And for yours, I just didn't have to do that at all because I knew that you'd be on time because of these auto-advancing slides.
Yeah, although last time I was on time, and then the video that I wanted to put in, I just played as I walked off stage, which was a little bit cheeky. And
Was that the Windows Terminal one?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that'll be definitely coming up a bit later. Oh, that was such a good video.
It's the best sizzle reel for any of the technologies I've seen.
I will include that in the show notes. If all this public speaking and doing all this work for Microsoft hasn't taken up enough of your time, you then decided to write a book.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an interesting choice. So I've always liked writing blog posts. There's something I find very satisfying about it. The number of times I've sat down to write a blog post and gone, well, it's this, and I can write that, and I know what I'm going to say. And you get partway through trying to explain something, you go, I need to go and look that bit up. And you suddenly realise the things you thought you understood, you don't actually understand quite as well. And I think that's part of what I enjoy about the process of writing things. Yeah, I get the same to some degree with like conference talks and things as well. I like to kind of be solid in the stuff I put in the blog post. And I've done a couple of magazine articles. They were great. I had a couple of MSDN magazine articles. Very sad that that's a publication that's no longer in existence. And really enjoyed that. And I've always had this slight kind of sense that a book would be interesting to do. but kind of didn't particularly think it would be something I'd ever necessarily get round to. And then it turns out I did.
It's something that's been on my mind to do for years, and I just never get the time, to be honest. I think now I've started this podcast, writing a book is definitely out of the window.
Yeah, there's only so many things you can pick up and keep up with at one time, right?
Yeah, definitely. I suppose the question is, would you write another one?
Not this year. So I don't know. It was interesting. One of the things that was appealing, so the publisher contacted me. They'd seen some of my blog posts. They'd actually seen some of the recordings of sessions I've done, including some at .NET Oxford. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, they just sort of said, look, we're looking for someone to write a book about WSL. Are you interested in discussing it? I had a bit of think and went, yeah, let's talk about it and see, find out a bit more. And as we started going through, we sort of mapped out a rough content kind of idea at a very, very high level. And they said, we're looking for 150 to 200 pages. I was like, well, okay, that's not a massive tome of a book as some of the old kind of computer books have gone. I mean, that feels like it might be a doable length. And then, it just kind of went from there. Totally underestimated how much work it would actually be, which is, I think if I'd estimated more accurately, we might not have decided that it was something that we wanted to go ahead with. But it was an interesting journey, learned a ton. Yeah, it was a very different kind of experience writing a book compared to blog posts and magazine articles and conference talks.
Yeah, it must have been quite special, though, and worth the work when you got that physical copy of the book with your name on it in your hands.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Emily has been a massive support. It wouldn't have happened without her help, basically. The amount of space we ended up having to kind of create to do that work. I'd get up, come out into the office and write for an hour, and go in, have breakfast, and get ready, and then come start kind of the day job. Had a long period where I'd be out at 6 or 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning and do several hours. Then, once we got the content outline for the book agreed, they start talking about the schedule for the book is this, and it's based off of writing 2 pages a day. And I sort of heard that, I went, well, maybe that's not so bad. But kind of that 2 pages a day, some of those pages are things that you can write naturally, and other bits you've got to go off and create some sample code and figure out exactly what it is you're trying to show. And then there's all the review cycles where the editor sends back the first preliminary draft, and that kind of happens a couple of times, and it goes off to tech reviewers, and then the tech reviewers send feedback, and that goes round, and then a whole other set of editing kind of teams that kind of kick through. So all of that just on top of this kind of 2 pages a day was that was definitely part of the underestimation of the effort involved. But my wife and the kids have been fantastic, as the dedication at the front hopefully conveyed, and the reaction from them when I went, "It's my book," and held it up was phenomenal. Totally matched my own feelings. It was that was a properly good moment.
I can imagine. So I've read your book, and one of the things I love about it is that it covers not just WSL, but tons of other stuff as well, like Docker, Kubernetes, VS Code, Windows Terminal, and a lot more as well, lots of tips and tricks along the way. Obviously, I don't want to give too much away because you want to sell your book, but given there's so much cool content in there, I don't think there's any risk of us giving away too much.
It was kind of interesting as because we want a book about WSL kind of email came in for the publishers, like, well, what is it about WSL? And there's the core of WSL, which is cool. Like there's some amazing stuff there from an engineering perspective. There's some amazing stuff just kind of in terms of being able to run standard Linux programs on a Windows machine, and the different interoperability between Windows and Linux that totally sets WSL apart from just spinning up a VM on Windows, which you've been able to do for a long, long time. But I use WSL daily. I used to have 2 machines, one with Windows, one with Linux. And certainly for any of the kind of Docker, Kubernetes type work, would often find myself on the Linux box doing that. And I'm down to 1 machine now with WSL because it provides, especially with WSL2, it provides a really productive experience for doing all those tasks just on a single machine. But it's not just WSL I'm using at that point. I'm bringing in Docker Desktop, which has amazing support for WSL, and running the Docker daemon in WSL, Windows Terminal, which is a massive step forwards for kind of Microsoft Terminal environments, and kind of automatically brings in your WSL profiles just to make it feel like a really nice kind of environment. And then VS Code, which has the remote development extension pack, which brings in the ability to split out your language services, debugger, etc., from the user interface, and then you can have all those language services running inside WSL in the VS Code server, but keep the UI on Windows. So it bridges that divide really nicely. There's remote SSH, which lets you SSH to another machine, and then a VS Code server runs those there. And then there's remote containers where you have a Docker file that defines a container where you want all your development tooling to run. And then, your VS Code server runs inside the container, your code's mounted in the container, and all the tools run inside there, but you still get the Windows user interface. So some really cool pieces that they've done in the VS Code product to enable that. And I find myself using those quite regularly.
I feel that we've covered an awful lot in a short space of time now. Can we just break it down a bit and just start off with, like, for those that haven't used WSL2, what it actually brings to the table?
Yep. So with WSL1, the engineering team created an interop layer between Linux syscalls and the Windows kernel. So when you ran a Linux process on WSL1, anytime it tried to make a syscall, it went to this interop layer. And if it was a syscall that had been implemented, then it would be executing on top of the Windows kernel, but transparently. Now, the challenge is that there are a lot of syscalls. The team did an awesome job of getting kind of like the core set there. And they actually had some instrumentations that if you called a syscall that wasn't available, they could track that, and then they could aggregate that and go, what are the top syscalls we need to implement, and go and tackle it. And they iterated really quickly. So actually the support kept improving quite quickly for WSL1. There's still a point where you reach places where it's harder to keep up syscalls that are more challenging to implement in a performant way as you try to bridge the two worlds, because you're trying to kind of essentially make Windows look like Linux. And there are some different design decisions, and there are places where performance suffered, and then there's other places where things just took a philosophically different perspective, and it's hard to reconcile those. I gave an example actually at one of the lightning talks at .NET Oxford of, on Windows, if you have a file open and you try to rename its parent directory, that's an operation that fails. On Linux, that operation can succeed quite happily, and it's, well, how do you marry up those two things in an interop layer? So with WSL2, the team, as far as I understand it, we're looking at kind of the feedback. And again, the feedback that we're getting is we need better compatibility and we need better performance. So they went off to think about this and came back and they went, the solution to this is a virtual machine, which kind of, when you're used to WSL and you're used to being able to kind of call between Windows and Linux and Windows, a VM feels like a very hard boundary to kind of put in place again. But actually they managed to do the work to keep all those interop pieces. So inside this WSL2 virtual machine, you can still access all your Windows files and vice versa. And there's a lightweight VM technology that they've got. So actually starting up that VM is crazy fast. It starts up using a really small amount of memory, and it dynamically grows and shrinks that the memory that VM's using. So actually it fits into a development environment way more tightly than just running a VM ever would.
So presumably this is much better than where developers might have in the past used something like Cygwin? This is much more like real Linux.
This is, you can go and grab a Linux binary and just run it unmodified. Yeah, so I mean, with WSL2, it's the Linux kernel that's there inside this lightweight VM, and you're running on top of that. So in terms of compatibility, boom, that's a tick. One difference between WSL1 and WSL2, in WSL1, any file access inside WSL had a performance hit because that was going through this interpretation kind of layer. But accessing the Windows file system was fast. In WSL2, it's the other way around. So accessing Linux file system, you're just accessing the file system inside the VM really, really fast. Going back across to Windows, that's now where there's an interop layer. But it's just interop at a file system level. So for most things, you don't notice it. If you're doing heavy operations, heavy I/O, you will see a performance degradation. So kind of generally, if you're going to be working in WSL on files, have those files inside the WSL file system, and you're in a better place.
So does that mean that WSL1 is faster in one direction, where WSL2 is faster in the other direction?
Yeah. So WSL1 is faster to access the Windows file system from Linux than WSL2. But if you move your code into WSL2, you'll generally have a smoother experience there than with WSL1.
Nice. One thing, like I've played around with WSL, and I think one of the things that I was really looking forward to was the Docker desktop integration for Docker, so that I didn't need to have a Hyper-V VM running in the background, hogging all those resources. So that was one of the main things that I was wanting WSL2 for. But reading through your book, I was really impressed with, as you mentioned, about the interoperability between the two. I didn't realize it had that level where you can just do so much from either side, either from Linux or Windows.
Yeah, I think it's hard until you start to kind of play with some of that stuff and look at it a bit more. It's hard to see just how much WSL actually gives you in that space. You are bringing the two things together rather than just having, it's very much the opposite end of the scale to running a Linux VM on a Windows machine, where the two systems kind of sit side by side, but they're in their own boxes. And one of my favorite things with WSL, if I run some scripts, get some output, and I want to put it in a Teams chat or in an email or something, or stick it in a README, you can just pipe it to clip.exe. Clip.exe is the utility that's been around on Windows for ages now, and it takes anything you pipe to it and puts it on the Windows clipboard. So from inside, Bash on my Ubuntu distro on WSL, I can do a Docker PS and pipe that into clip.exe, and that pipes it into clip.exe, the Windows program from the Linux side. So, just little things like that make the two worlds really come closer together.
Yeah, I do love that. Clip.exe. One thing I do find, which is a bit of a gotcha with it, is if you're using PowerShell, that it literally just clips what gets outputted to the command line. Where if you're using PowerShell and you need to clip something, and PowerShell's also got, I think it's called set clipboard or something, which would actually take the entire output, not what just gets rendered to the terminal. Another thing I didn't realise about WSL from after reading your book, obviously I don't want to give too much away, but the amount of tooling. So obviously you've got the main WSL.exe, but you've got other things like WSL View. So there's quite a few command line tools to help you interact with WSL.
Yeah, the WSL utilities stuff are brilliant. There's this whole thing of mapping the paths. So from within a distro in WSL, you can access /mount/C to access your C drive. So any of your Windows paths you can map into a corresponding path that's accessible in Linux, and anything inside your distro, there's a / WSL dollar share. So you get kind of WSL dollar /Ubuntu /home/Stuart will give you the home directory, and for me in the Ubuntu distro. There's a WSL path utility that lets you, do those mappings kind of in a scripted way, which is useful at points. And then if I take some of that stuff, I can start notepad.exe and give it a path, and I can map, a path from one file system kind of descriptor to another, and then have things load up. And actually, it turns out that that's not even necessary in a lot of cases because of how the paths line up and the way the WSL dollar share has been designed. But there are points where, as I call Notepad to load up a text file, for example, if I was on Windows and just running in PowerShell, I wouldn't even put Notepad there. I'd just put myfile.txt, and you could do start and pass it a thing like that, and it will load up the default application for that in Windows. And one of the WSL utilities, WSL View, does exactly that, but from the WSL side. So you can do WSL View, give it a JPEG, and it'll open your default image program for a JPEG in Windows. Or if you do WSL View and you give it a URL, it'll open that URL in your default browser. So some of those bits I find really, really convenient as you just go through kind of scripting things and rerunning commands.
Nice. And there's tons of examples in the book, so go buy the book.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because, I'm getting back to that point where I said, what should the content outline look like? I was like, well, need to cover some of the WSL stuff, obviously, and we want to kind of make it accessible to people who haven't used WSL, but there's a whole bunch of things that, I've gradually figured out after working with WSL1 and now WSL2 that aren't necessarily always immediately obvious. I want to get those bits in. And then there's all the pieces that I enjoy using around kind of the edge with Windows Terminal and VS Code and Docker Desktop and things. So it really was hard to kind of go, yes, it's a WSL book, but there's all these other bits that really take WSL as their base and really kind of come into their own in a WSL kind of environment.
Even things like Docker and Kubernetes, where in the book you actually introduce that and almost telling a story, building up from Docker, explaining Docker Compose to Kubernetes, and then how that fits into WSL. And we can talk about this in a bit, but like you mentioned earlier, the VS Code remote WSL stuff. There was one snippet which piqued my interest. Microsoft has announced support for GUI applications in the upcoming release of WSL.
Yeah, so as of right now, you could go and set things up and install kind of X server and other pieces and basically get a GUI applications in Linux surfaced in Windows. But there's a bunch of manual steps and there's some bits there that don't necessarily kind of work most smoothly. So I kind of played with it a little bit, but I didn't find it really fitted into my workflow. Most of my workflows I can do with things like the VS Code remote WSL support. And I found that works better. If the VS Code scenario doesn't work for you, then taking a look at some of the blog posts that people have written for X server support with WSL might be worth doing. But yeah, I think it was at Build this year, GUI support. In fact, GUI and GPU support were both announced, I think, at Build. So yeah, in a coming update of WSL2, I guess it'll be the next major one whenever that actually comes. They'll be looking to have built-in support for that GUI story. So, run your favorite GUI editor from Linux, but have it show up in Windows through WSL. So I think that'd be kind of an interesting. If you're, I know you talked at the Lightning Talk session recently about Rider for a .NET IDE. If you're doing Linux-based development, being able to sort of run that stuff in Linux, but then install the Linux version of Rider and then have that show up as an application on Windows and see all the GUI and interact with it. It starts to broaden out the appeal in terms of the audiences that you bring in from WSL.
Yes, because I do use Rider. I know in your book you do a lot of the editor integration is around VS Code. So it would certainly be nice to have some kind of support for other IDEs like Rider. Speaking of VS Code, I know you've covered a few different extensions like remote WSL and remote containers and something called dev containers as well.
Yeah, so dev containers is kind of the informal name for the remote, how you work with the remote containers extension. So the container that gets built for you automatically from the Docker file you describe for working with the remote containers extension tend to refer to as the dev container. So you can package all of your tooling in there. It seems like a slightly weird thing, I think, to some people at first. But actually, the more time I've spent with it, the more I really like it. And I have various different pet projects that are on the go. And with dev containers, I can set up a container that's got all the tools I need and the particular versions of those tools for that project. And then if I have another project that uses either different tooling or different versions of the same tooling, it can have its own container. And then I'm working with that. And then when I go back to the first project, I pick up that same container definition and I'm working with it. And I don't have the issue of, that was working with Go 11 back when I was doing that project. And this one's now working with Go 13. And I've installed Go 13 on my machine. Now I've got to upgrade the other project. Because oftentimes I go back to a project and it's because I need to make a quick change and, push that up to make an update to a site or something like that. So being able to just kind of keep those definitions with the project, I found really helpful. And on one of the first projects we did at work where we were using dev containers, one of my colleagues set up bash completion. So it was stored in a volume for the dev container, which basically means that every time you load that container up, you get that same bash history. And if you name the volumes differently between your containers, each project now has its own bash history, which turns out to be a really productive thing. There's a PR I made to the ZeroRM Terraform provider, and I submitted that back at the end of June. But there are a bunch of other downstream dependencies, like several layers deep. And as they gradually got unpicked, I sort of went back and I did a rebase. But I could just go back like a couple of commands in my bash history, and I had all the commands there to set up the environment variables I needed for the test and then run the test. I didn't have to kind of keep a note of them somewhere and dig that out each time. It was just there. So I found them a really productive way of working. And in a team environment, of course, you commit that Docker file into source control, and everyone gets the same set of tools on their machine, irrespective of which platform they're running VS Code on. So, at the moment, we've got a project going on with people on Windows, people on Macs. Everyone gets the same set of tools. If someone adds a tool in, well, that gets added to the Docker file. Everyone else then pulls that down, rebuilds, and they've got all the latest tools. So you don't get that sudden, oh, sorry, I forgot to add this to the list in the README of things you need to install. And let me go and do that, and then you can go manually install it. So it sort of helps in that scenario quite nicely as well.
And apparently you can build a WSL distro from a Docker file, if I remember from your book.
Yeah, a fun little thing you can put in. So you can import and export WSL distros. So it's probably worth stepping back. With WSL, you can have multiple different distros installed on your machine. And it's kind of fun to go and get a distro from the Windows Store or the Microsoft Store. But as you pull those down, you might have set up kind of a bunch of tools. Maybe you're about to, you've just got a new machine and you're going to transfer everything over. You can export a WSL distro, copy it over to the new machine, and then re-import it. So you can bring kind of that environment across with you. Or you could export it and then re-import it on the same machine if you wanted a second copy because you wanted to kind of go off and play with some things, but be able to throw it away afterwards. And the export format is basically a tar file that is the file system for the distro. And if you export a running container or export a container, you can get that out as a tar file. So the two things line up nicely. So I think the example I gave in the book was for .NET 5, which was in preview at the point I wrote the chapter. So I could take the latest Docker image for the .NET 5 previews, run a few commands just to set up the user and password and a couple of bits of config, export that from Docker, and then import it as a distro in WSL. And I've got a distro where I've got the preview installed, and I can go and throw it away afterwards when I'm done playing.
Yeah, I do like with containers, just all the different use cases. I've never even thought about the bash history thing, but I just find like every day I find a different use case for hacking with containers. That's a good name for a book, actually. Hacking with containers.
Yeah, the bash history one's kind of fun. I've been kind of every now and again I come back to it and go, is there a way I could make this work kind of without containers? Just because there are points where I'm doing stuff just on the host and be like, can I scope my history for this session and then bring that scope back later? But I never really kind of get properly into thinking about it. There's a bunch of stuff that they've put in with the dev container support. So they bring in your git config from your host. So if you've got aliases set up, you get those inside the dev container. They set up the credential manager to forward back to the host credential manager, which is a nice touch. If you have SSH agent running and you've got the SSH auth sock environment variable set, then inside the container they set up forwarding for that socket so that any requests for SSH keys actually go back to the host. There's a bunch of stuff that actually it's a bit like with WSL where, yes, you've got a Linux VM, but it doesn't feel like a Linux VM when you're running because you've got this interop between Windows and Linux. The dev container environment, when it's set up and kind of you're going through like that, it doesn't necessarily feel like you're running inside a container because there's all these other bits that kind of work with the host quite nicely to integrate. And it's been a really interesting experience going through, and I really enjoy it.
That's very, very cool. One thing I did want to touch on before we do finish is Windows Terminal. We've already mentioned Windows Terminal, and I'm a huge, huge fan of the Windows Terminal. As we said before, there was this amazing video which I'll include in the show notes, which you did at the end of your your WSL2 lightning talk, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah. It was one that the product group put out as kind of a bit of a sort of marketing video. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was quite fun. And I think that was the video where, if you look carefully, there's a bit where lots of different terminal windows kind of fly up. And if you look at the usernames in there, you can see the people who are involved in Windows Terminal, which is a nice touch.
I liked it when you did your lightning talk and the video showed at the end and the music came out of the surround sound speakers at the venue and it sounded incredible.
Yeah, it's fun though.
One of the things I used very heavily in a Windows Terminal is split screen, split panes. so like horizontal and vertical panes. But I did not know until I read your book that you could automate that on the command line. So you could set up different custom profiles from the command line. So that's been really useful, because I quite often, when I'm doing local development, I might have, if I'm running multiple services, like let's say .NET run commands, I would have them in different panes so I can see the streams together. I know I could use something like Docker Compose, but I just quite like having them in separate panes, and that works really well. So being able to just have preset profiles from the command line, that's really useful.
I'd like to say that was a tip that I knew was going to be in there at the outset. That was one of the bits where, as I started researching stuff, I found out cool stuff that has definitely improved how I do stuff now. The Windows Terminal stuff was kind of challenging to put in a book as well, because the project is going at such a pace. They've got such a regular release cadence, and they're putting more and more in feature-wise each time. That it was really hard to try and kind of balance what are the core bits, what are the cool bits, and what's going to be old news and replaced by other things in a short amount of time. But yeah, I hope there was kind of enough in there to kind of give a good grounding and some tips that aren't necessarily immediately obvious when you start. The command palette is one of the big things they added recently that I absolutely love.
Yeah, it's amazing, like, because it's a terminal, but as you say, they're iterating so quickly on it. One thing I saw near the end of the book is you mentioning a project called dot files, which I've not heard of before.
I can't remember when I first came across dot files, but the idea being, a bit like you've got dot bash RC and dot bash profile that are used to set up your environment, sort of have that config, but somewhere that you can kind of share across multiple machines. If you search for dot files, you'll find a whole bunch of people talk about how to set them up, different tools that they've used to layer immense kind of setups that work across different environments and things. And people have done some genuinely impressive stuff. I've kind of just handcrafted my stuff as I've gone, but there's some bits in there that we'll test if they're on WSL and conditionally add some aliases or bits in there. But VS Code has some really nice support. So if you're in dev containers, then you can basically say, anytime I start a dev container, go clone this .files repo and run this script to do the install from that repo. And I think there's kind of if you're putting together a dev container for a team, there's some stuff that is absolutely core tooling, and that absolutely goes in the dev container. There's other stuff where I quite often have a markdown linter. I've got a couple of Git utilities. There's a Git graph utility, which is amazing. There's a Git rebase shortcuts utility, which I really like. So when you have if you do a Git rebase interactive, you get the list of commits up that you can reorder and you can drop and fix up and squash and all that kind of stuff. So, I set VS Code up to be my Git editor. So, if I'm in the integrated terminal on a project in VS Code and I do Git rebase interactive, it pops up that file inside the terminal. And then if you want to change a pick to a drop or a pick to a fix, you can just press the first letter whilst you're on that line, and it changes it. So you don't have to go to the start of the line and type it. So if when I make a really messy commit history and then want to just clean it up ready for a PR, that is a really kind of nice little thing that fits in my flow really well. But those aren't necessarily tools that everyone wants to have in the dev container. And the more stuff I throw in the dev container and everyone else throws in as extensions to install, the longer it takes to build that for everyone. So with the dot files, I can add in a bunch of things to say, I want these aliases created. For example, I find it really hard to retrain myself to type clear rather than CLS. Which shows kind of my lineage.
I'm exactly the same.
and equally, alongside the dot files, you can say these are extensions I always want to be installed, even if the dev container doesn't ask for it. So those two things let you really kind of personalize a dev container environment to keep all the tools that you individually think are core to you and how you work on top of anything that's there kind of on a per project basis. So sometimes you have to kind of stop and think, is this something that I want or something that everyone on the project should have and figure that out. But yeah, I like to have the Git bash prompt stuff installed, those aliases and a few extensions, and dot files has been a really productive way for doing that. If you look at what's now GitHub code spaces, one kind of aspect of code space is if you create a code space for a repository that's got a dev container, then the code space that gets created for you as part of the service builds that dev container for you. And then when you connect VS Code to that code space, it's like having a dev container, but with the dev container hosted for you remotely, which sounds like it'd be really slow. But if you, I mean, I'm on a Surface Pro, which if you get a large project like the Terraform Azure provider and all the Go tooling, it takes a certain amount of runs on a machine to run that in a performant manner. Well, if I'm doing work on that and it's starting to really kind of slow me down with that, then I can run a code space. I can say, give me a 4-core machine or beefier machine and host the dev container for this in the code spaces service. And then I have VS Code locally connecting to that. And actually, if you're on a reasonable internet connection, the experience is really quite snappy. Like the IntelliSense experience I get in that scenario is better than just running it all locally.
It feels like all of this tooling as well, just great for teams for sharing config and everything. But also, if you need to tear down your machine and rebuild it, then it's all source controlled, it's all configuration as code. And also for onboarding, I guess, as well, new developers onto a team.
Yeah. It's like, if you join a project partway through, you get WSL and Docker installed if you're on Windows, clone the repo, open up VS Code, it says, oh, there's a dev container. Do you want to build and open that? You say, yes, let me go and grab a cup of coffee and come back. And it's built the dev container from scratch, pulled in all the dependencies, installed all the extensions, and you're there ready to go with everything set up. It's quite a powerful thing in a team environment. And we've also been using them in the CI toolchain as well. So rather than have a set of tools that need to be installed in the CI environment, let's build a container and run the container. So when I do a make deploy locally, why not reuse that script as a make deploy inside the container in the CI?
Yeah, definitely. And on your build agents, just not having to do all the updates every time a new version of Node or .NET or whatever it is comes in. As long as you've got Docker, it just works. I really like that too. So going on a complete tangent now, and I feel awful because we can see each other in the webcams. We've both got standing desks. I can see you're stood up and I'm sat down. I remember before I invested in my standing desk, we had like a long chat about standing desks, and you've had one for ages. I should add that I have been stood up. You've had yours a lot longer than I have. I've found like quite a big difference in. I actually wrote a blog post, which I can include in the show notes, about my experiences with it. So just being less sedentary throughout the day, because we as software developers spend like 7-8 hours a day sat down every day. And I've just found that the standing desk has made a big difference.
Yeah, no, me too. I find now that I'm used to it, I'm less tired at the end of the day than I was without a standing desk and just using a normal desk setup. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but I found when I was sat down, you'd start the day and you'd try and have good posture. But by the end of the day, I kind of felt like I got more and more hunched over. And that hunch kind of translated in not just a physical hunch, but also kind of a mental slump as well. And with a standing desk, I find I don't do that. I tend to move about quite a lot, even when I'm just stood typing or watching a command or reading posts. I'm looking into more information around what I'm doing. If I'm on calls, I've got a Bluetooth headset, I tend to be pacing up and down the office. Just kind of being on your feet already makes it much easier to do that. It felt a bit hard when I started. I definitely felt that kind of I was balancing between standing and sitting. I had a little bit of trouble kind of with lower back. Someone recommended an anti-fatigue mat, which made a massive difference for me. Someone else recommended just get yourself a decent pair of shoes and actually wear shoes while you're there. Whereas I tended to just have kind of socks on or a pair of slippers or something beforehand. And a decent pair of shoes and the anti-fatigue mat as a combination made a huge difference. And now I tend to just spend all day standing up. A week off, not unwell, kind of a month or so back, and when I was coming back from that, I did kind of balance standing and sitting a little bit, just as the energy levels were kind of picking up. But as soon as I was back to kind of normal strength, I've been back standing all day.
Now I feel even more guilty the fact I'm sat down right now. But it's nice because it's a motor, so I can press a button and it can go back up again. So because I've got a very old back injury that I did years ago, which comes back every so often. When I first started, I did literally just went in to doing all day, and the following weekend it triggered my back. I know it wasn't good, but then luckily when it does reoccur a few days later, it's fine. So it's just a short-lived thing. So now I'm kind of like alternating between going up and then standing up for a bit, sitting down for a bit, standing up for a bit. So as you say, it's kind of when you're in meetings and stuff, if you're not talking, I can like do a bit of stretching or something, which when I'm sat down, I would just be sat stationary. Am I allowed to say what you told me last time we were having a chat about, and you're bobbing around, walking around, dancing?
Yeah, so I have a guitar. I had a period where I did quite a lot of travelling with my role. I got an amazing traveller guitar. So that's down on one side of my desk. So I can just kind of, I've got a little sort of bar stool-like thing that's got a wobbly kind of base so you don't sit on it too kind of slumped. So, if I'm waiting for a build to run, I might pick the guitar up and just kind of watch the output, or ukulele the other side of the desk. So kind of, I find just somehow it lends itself to that. The travelling guitar is quite nice and light, and the ukulele is obviously nice and small, so they both kind of work for standing up.
Nice. Have you seen the XKCD cartoon where there's two devs sword fighting, and then the boss shouts, "Get back to work," and they shout, "Compiling." So the boss goes, "Okay, carry on then."
Yes.
So is that you playing the guitar? It's compiling.
Yeah. So actually, it's been really interesting because before I had the uke and the guitar out here, they used to live in the house, and occasionally I'd bring them out, but they predominantly lived in the house. Now it's the inverse of that. So before they were out here, you'd get a point where the build was going, and I'd go off and I'd check email, or I'd check Teams, or I'd go look off something else, and suddenly realised that I spent 15 minutes doing that, and the build had finished ages ago. Whereas now, actually, the build's going, I pick up the uke, play it for a couple of minutes, go, "Oh, look, that build failed, or it succeeded, or whatever," put it down, and I'm back. So it actually helps stop some of the context switching that I would have otherwise done. So it helps kind of keep me focused on the task I'm doing, which sounds kind of perverse, but yeah, I found it really helpful.
So we did a recording for the podcast on Tuesday about the DDD conferences, and if you look in the chart, I put a link, I can share in the show notes for the listeners, and talking about guitars and things, at the end of the recording we all realised that most of us had guitars and things in the background of the webcams. So we ended up getting them out and taking a photo. There's a few of us with guitars, and I think they've got a flute in there.
That's amazing.
It was a stage photo, but it was quite funny. Cool. So did you say that you're up for a dev tip?
Dev tip.
Although I was saying that you've done like hundreds of dev tips throughout this thing, so maybe you've already done yours.
I'm sure there's still plenty of dev tips left in the book. Yeah. So I think, I'm going to go slightly more meta than my usual dev tip. Kind of, I tend to be about all the details. Be questioning, like question stuff. I think as I've gone through writing blog posts, and especially having just written the book, there were points where I was trying to explain something. I went, well, if I leave this out, then I can just kind of explain stuff, and I don't just look stuff up. I'm like, yeah, but I actually want to do a good job of explaining this, so I'm going to go off and look that bit up that I sort of vaguely know, but can't properly articulate. And I think it's easy, when you've got time pressures, to kind of, you get something working, and the bit that got it working was a one-line change that you saw somewhere, or you thought, I'll just try it, and you don't really know why that change made it work, whereas what you thought was going to work originally didn't. And I think just questioning what about that change made it work, and exploring that. I think if you can cultivate that kind of mindset where possible, then it really kind of pays off.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pause for a second while I wait for I can hear them running past. No, is it gone? I said Mason. With Mason, he's kind of like, when he gets in these silly moods, he's like a seriously wasted, happy old person. Do you like? If imagine it. A bloke that's like wasted, really happy, and just laughing and just shouting out the top of his voice. But it's so funny. That's a really, really good dev tip. I generally find just having like the questioning mindset, it just creates deeper understanding. I think just question everything that you're unsure about. Don't blag some. I'm sure you heard a lot.
That was an amazing squeal. I love it. Sorry, I'm just admiring that photo of everyone with their instruments.
Oh, that one.
You said that was the DDD sessions.
Yeah, it's really. I'm halfway through editing this one. There was like all 6 of us at the same time, so that I've got like 6 tracks which I'm editing, and because Squadcast doesn't support that many guests, then everyone was recording it locally using Audacity. So basically, I got sent a WAV file. I've got to make sure they're aligned and then chop through. And as I say, I chop out all like there was lots of like tangent conversations which couldn't go into the podcast.
Yeah.
So going through editing, chopping bits out. Generally, I'm finding with the podcast, and especially with 6 of us, that quite often, and we've had it a couple of times today, where we both start talking at the same time, and then one person stops and the other person carries on, because they're recorded on separate WAV files. Then even if all 6 of us started talking at the same time, you can make that sound completely neat and seamless really easily. I'm really enjoying editing. It's just, so I put my headphones on, go through, and I know all the keyboard shortcuts for Adobe Audition, which is what I use.
I'm surprised to learn that, yeah.
No, you're not.
No, not in the slightest.
Keyboard shortcuts just make you more productive. It's funny how the parallels between something like audio editing and coding, just different ideas effectively, and as long as you learn how to use your tool, then there's lots of parallels there. So my dev tip is a small productivity tip, which is not related to the topic we're covering today. But one thing I do at the end of each day, I even do this at my lunch breaks, is I'd call it notes for next, and I would just make a little note of where I was up to, a brain dump. So the next morning I can come in and just hit the ground running. So I've done that for a few years now, and the days that I forget to do it, I lose like 10 minutes straight away of the day by just like trying to find where I was up to, get my head back in that mindset, where by doing this, I can just immediately hit the ground running.
Yeah, I find that I've always got, actually for the stuff I'm doing like that, I tend to just have pencil and paper, and I find that kind of suits my mental flow. So I've got like the stuff I need to do, some notes of people I need to speak to and what it is, and all that's kind of there, and I can just stick big asterisks or boxes around things and things like that. And then, yeah, like you say, kind of this is the stuff that I'm partway through in my mental plan of what I was going to look at next, scribble that down, and you can page it back in the morning when you come back in, and it really does help.
Yeah, definitely. So an absolutely huge, massive thank you for joining us on the show then. I'll include a link to the book, and I think this is going to be a long list of show notes. But basically, listeners, go buy the book. It's awesome. So seriously, a massive thank you, Stuart, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Since recording the show, Stuart has very kindly provided us with a discount code for his new book. Use code 25WSL when ordering directly from the Packet website to get 25% off. I'll include a link to that in the show notes. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by my own company, Everstack, providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you could help me out by spreading the word of this podcast on social media, I normally use #unhandledexception. That would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening, and see you next time in the next episode.